So we're done with the top portion of the page container. If we take a look at the layers panel here inside of Photoshop, if you turn off the hello layer group, which is inside of the page layer group, if you turn off the visibility of that, you can see that we've completed that section. What we want to take a look at now is this albums section. So if I turn off the visibility of this layer group, you'll see the area that we need to focus on. Here we have 4 placeholder images or thumbnails. They have borders around them. There's also a hyperlink underneath them, and these hyperlinks have little icons to the left of them. And we also have a border down here towards the bottom as a separator. And if you can't see that, just go ahead and zoom into that section, and you'll notice that it's the exact same border that we used in the hello section. So there's a little bit of work to do here. The first thing that I want to do is I want to establish the HTML structure. And this can become confusing at this point because we have so many div elements in here. One thing that you can probably do inside of your code editor is format the code. By formatting the code, it'll create the necessary indents to be able to distinguish the differences between different containers and div elements. And if you're having trouble doing that, a program like Dreamweaver gives you the ability to select a div tag and collapse it. So you can go through div element by div element and begin to collapse them. So here we can see this is the article, and then the article is being held by hello. And I think that's where we want to be. We want to be inside of content. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and open up a new div element. I'll go ahead and type in div. And by the way, if your positioning is wrong here, you're going to know when you test it and look at it in a web browser. We're going to give this an ID of albums. So go ahead and type that in. Obviously, it's an ID selector that we're going to create. Then we want to close off the div element before we forget. And inside the albums div, what we want to do is set up an unordered list. And we're going to use a class called noStyle. And if you're using an editor that has code hinting, you'll notice that noStyle is a class that already exists. It's part of the F2FW framework, and we'll take a look at what it offers in just a bit. We also want to add the CF, which, as you know, is a clear float class that's part of the F2FW framework. So after opening up the UL element here, we're going to close it, and then we're going to add some list items. Before we start populating these list items, I just want to put it in place here. We want to come in and start manipulating our CSS because we're not really going to use this list item in a way that you may think that you would based upon the fact that we have 4 thumbnails that we're trying to get into this HTML document. So after doing that, let's return back to style.css. And what we want to talk about, first of all, is exactly what's going on with some of those classes that we referenced. So like I said, we've referenced the noStyle class for the UL element. And if you want to go through and do a find and replace, you'll see that it exists within the F2FW framework. It's basically setting the list style property to none. So there's no need to go in and do that for the individual list items. So that's kind of nice. What we want to do right now is just set up some spacing. So I'm going to scroll all the way down here towards the bottom of our CSS document, and we're going to create a new ID selector called albums. So go ahead and type that in, albums. Open and close the curly braces. Again, if you come back to the index page, we're using that ID here for this new div element. And what we want to do is just set up some basic properties. The first thing that we want to set up is the bottom border property, again, to create that division down here towards the bottom between this albums section and this blog section. And it's going to look a lot like the selector that we created earlier. We're going to type in border hyphen bottom, and you can use code hinting if it's available to you. We're going to set this to 1 pixel, dotted, and the color is going to be D2, D2, D2. After setting up that selector, what we want to do is add some padding values for the unordered list, and we also want to manipulate the list item property a little bit. So again, we want to be pretty specific with these selectors. So again, we're going to use the albums ID selector. So go ahead and type that in. But then we want to get specific and target the UL element. When that's found, what we want to do is set the padding property to 0. After doing that, we're going to set up yet another album ID selector. So I'll go ahead and type in albums. But this time, we want to target not only the UL element, but more specifically the LI element. And here, we're going to set a few more properties. We're going to start off with margin. So again, we'll go ahead and type that in. We're going to use shorthand notation. We're going to do 0, 24 pixels. Now, where am I coming up with this 24 pixel value? Well, if you come back to Photoshop, if you wanted to, you could measure the distance between these elements. If you choose the marquee tool, again, you have that heads-up display. If I click and drag, you can see that I'm not all that precise right now, but if I click and drag, I'm working basically with 24 pixels. I'm just a pixel off there. That's 24 pixels of white space between these two thumbnails. So that's where we're coming up with that value. After typing in that, we're going to go with display, and we're going to set that to block. Then we're going to set the width to 219 pixels. So we'll go ahead and type that in. And again, if we come back to Photoshop, we can see that we're coming up with this value based upon, if I click and drag this out, the area that's going to be covered totally with the thumbnail and the actual borders associated with it. So that's 219 pixels. If you take a look at the info panel, you can see that that's verified. So I'm not making these numbers up. These are numbers that were calculated inside of the monoplate.psd file. Then we're going to set the float property to left. Then we want to have one more specific selector here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this definition to save a little bit of typing. I'm going to paste it, but we're going to add the paragraph element there, which we're not working with yet, but we will. And what we want to do is just zero out the margins for that tag. So there we go. That's the start of our CSS. And like I said, we were able to take these measurements from Photoshop. We're using the no style selector from the F2FW framework, which is zeroing out the padding and the margin. And then when it's used in conjunction with a list item, we're setting the list style type to none. And if you wanted to, you could do a find and replace and look at that class definition within your CSS. It's all up there in the F2FW framework stuff. So we've done quite a bit so far. What we want to do is at least add one of the thumbnails so we can see it. So let's just come back to our index.html page. Make sure you save style.css. And inside of index.html, inside the list item, you want to open up a paragraph element. You're going to set the class to our thumbnail class. We're going to close that off. Inside the paragraph, we're going to open up an image tag. The source is going to be inside the includes directory. In fact, what I'll do here inside of Dreamweaver is browse for it. What we want to do is go inside the includes directory. In there is pictures, and in there is sample underscore 462 underscore 255. Actually, that's not the one. We want sample 170 underscore 300. So go ahead and click OK. The path is written out for you. We'll add an alt attribute and just type the # in as a placeholder, and then we can close this off. Then we can close off the paragraph element. And the last thing that we want to do, if we come back to Photoshop, is add this link down here towards the bottom. So go ahead and come back to the editor, and we're going to add another paragraph element. I'll go ahead and close it before I forget. And inside this paragraph element, what we want to do is create an anchor element. So again, I'm going to use the href attribute with a # as a placeholder. Same thing with the title attribute. And inside this anchor element, we want to type the words, "see more about this." So that's a good starting point. Let's go ahead and save our index.html page and take a look at it inside of Chrome. You should see the first thumbnail or image placeholder, whatever you want to call it, appear over here on the left with the hyperlink underneath it. And we also have the border underneath that. So there are some spacing issues, and obviously we have a border we need to add to this, and we need to add more than one of them to the page. But so far, so good. This is a good starting point. What we'll do is continue to build this out in the next movie.